The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
2.5 years out from an election and the NDP has a challenge. It's clear the ways that the current government isn't working, but the NDP needs to find a way to make the work they're doing visible to the public and find a way to affect change even though they're in opposition.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and a rare fall sitting of the BC Legislature and a couple of members of the opposition who've been busy in the House and on question period regularly on the show tonight. Welcome to the show, George Heyman. Good
Great to be back. Thank you.
And welcome to the show, Rob Fleming. Good to have you here.
Good to be back, Ron.
I have found it incredibly busy covering the legislature this fall. I think it's an example of why it's a good idea to have fall sittings. You people feeling a little strung out, George?
No, not particularly strung out, but of course this is not only my first fall sitting, but it's my first time being an MLA, so it's important to be here and debating the things we're debating.
Yeah. We had quite a wild ride this week with an announcement and then a withdrawal on the ferries. I think pretty much everybody on Vancouver Island was ticked off for at least 24 hours. What's your take on that, Rob Fleming?
Well, I think it was, in response to the opening clip there, I think it was a sign that the opposition and accountability is enhanced when the legislature's in session. To see a reversal like that within 24 hours, to see the minister go from we're looking at it to, maybe to no. I think it showed a couple things. First of all, he was overruled. And secondly, the independence of BC Ferries comes into question again, because that was clearly government saying, even though they will deny that BC Ferries is a Crown corporation, they clearly can give direction. And what island residents want, and they have the economic numbers to show that it's critical, is fares to be reasonable. We've lost a lot of gross domestic product. That report was presented to Todd Stone in advance of the Union of BC Municipalities meeting. He was very dismissive of the report. And I think this is a second own goal that he's scored on the ferries file as far as island residents are concerned. So I think there's a real loss of trust there from islanders. I mean, he was always going to have to prove himself, coming from Kamloops as he does, and lots of blacktop politics in that part of the world, that he had the island highway system's interests in mind, and I think he's made a couple of blunders here.
For those of you who are getting caught up on this, BC Ferries put a report out on September the 30th. I say put out, they gave it to the Ferry Commissioner. They didn't make it public. They didn't discuss it. This week, a colleague of mine, Rob Shaw, the Vancouver Sun, discovered the report on Tuesday and wrote it up. The short version of the recommendation that caused a huge furor was the Ferry Corporation said it's got a big congestion problem in the terminal at Horseshoe Bay. It is looking at a $200 million renovation. It thinks that's too expensive, so it's thinking maybe of moving ferry services out of Horseshoe Bay, some of them anyway, and taking all the traffic down to Tsawwassen. That was the position on Tuesday, and on Tuesday, the minister, Todd Stone, sounded like he thought it was a pretty good idea. By Wednesday, he wasn't ever going to do that again. George Heyman, your reaction?
Well, especially after he was saying on the one hand, while he's in Calgary, that it's only under review, at the same time virtually that the finance minister, Mike DeYoung, is saying in the legislature that they're absolutely not going to do that. I think it's another example of how tone-deaf this transportation minister is. He keeps talking about the ferry system as if it's some luxury for people who chose to live on an island, when it's an integral part of the transportation system. The studies that show that the subsidy per capita for the road system is about double that for the per capita subsidy for the ferries, but he just ignores that. When I was on the finance committee in Williams Lake listening to presentations from people in the tourism industry, they say they disputed his figures and showed him BC Ferry's own figures on ridership that were significantly higher than what he's claimed them to be. And he says they say he treated them with disdain.
You read that report, and I've traveled that ferry run myself. There certainly is a congestion issue in Horseshoe Bay, both with the small boats that are when the boats are coming in, the space is constricted, the traffic is constricted, and surprises me that it would take $200 million to fix the project, but I'm not an engineer. What would be the right way to deal with the issue?
Well, I'm not sure either. I mean, where he's coming from, because of course there were improvements made when the Sea to Sky Highway was reconfigured that did alleviate a lot of the congestion that you had on the upper levels highway. But the wrong way to do it is to do it in secret, and then to have a mixed message when it does become public, and to discount people who want to have a discussion. Obviously, Horseshoe Bay residents, but the traveling public that use this well-traveled route. So, to have this as some kind of surprise configuration that wasn't going to have any public input, I think is what people have come to know about this government, and it's one of the things they actively dislike about this government. And I think he had to climb down rather quickly because of that.
Halloween has just gone by, but Christmas came early to the BC legislature today, and so did the Grinch. George, tell us about that one.
Well, there has been a directive from Vancouver Island Health Authority to long-term care homes for seniors that while in the past, as the memo says, seniors were able to enjoy a lovely and quite delicious Christmas dinner and invite guests, invite their family to spend it with them, which is so important when people are in the last stages of their life, that there was no longer the budget for that. And in one instance, I think the number of guests that would be allowed for 80 seniors was 12. It conjures up the image of a lottery for which a lucky senior gets to have one of their younger relatives join them for the holiday season. And our health critic Judy Darcy, along with our leader John Horgan, put this question to the minister. And this is a perfect opportunity for the Minister of Health to say very clearly, even if he doesn't know the facts, even if he hasn't seen the memo, although his parliamentary secretary has had it for 2 weeks, to just say, look, if that's the case, we don't support it and it's not going to happen. And he refused to do that. He kept talking about influenza shots and virtually everything but the issue.
If people want to check that out, you can go on the parliamentary channel and watch Question Period. I think 12 or 14 questions. And he never said that, so I guess the Grinch is taking consultation on it. It was interesting to watch. The other thing we should mention, because it did come up this week and we don't have a question on tape on it, and just let people know about it, is the Jumbo Glacier Resort issue and whether or not the resort is being built in the path of an avalanche.
Yes.
So?
Well, and there's been concrete pads already poured that are on this sort of Class 4 avalanche site. John Horgan, again, led Question Period on this and produced and tabled with the House after some photographs of the area that had seen hundreds of thousands of tons of snow that had moved at speeds of up to 320 kilometers an hour and would have, destroyed buildings had there been buildings there and taken lives. The minister didn't have a lot of good examples. She said that respect the process and the permitting, but there's construction-related activity going on right now. So again, not too many convincing arguments about this ghost town that now has municipal status where nobody lives, but there is activity happening.
Yeah, the government, so people understand, they in order to, from their point of view, move the development ahead, they created it as a resort municipality. Yes. But there's no resort and there's no people.
That's right. On November 15th, nobody will be voting in that municipal election because nobody lives there.
This must be every politician's dream. No voters. It's like that famous episode of the British series, the Yes Minister, where they had the best hospital in Britain, no patients. That had the best numbers. Well, we may get to that. Look, there's an awful lot people wanted to ask the two new Democrats on the show, and we did have some ministers on this fall as well. So let's get started on some of it. We'll start with one of the big events in British Columbia this year. May turn out to be one of the big events in our history, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision recognizing Aboriginal rights and title in British Columbia to a tract of land for the first time, modern-day British Columbia anyway. And here with a question about that, looking at the government point of view, but also wondering where the opposition might be, my colleague from the Globe and Mail, Justine Hunter. Here's Justine.
There's a lot of anxiety, especially in the industry and in the investment community, about what it means. She wants to bring investors here for LNG. She does not need to set off an explosion right now that would spook anybody, because she's saying, you know, yes, I recognize it, and this means that title exists across British Columbia, and we're going to have to change everything.
What does it mean to your party so far?
Well, I think what it means to our party is what it means to British Columbia, and we've always said that First Nations rights and title need to be taken seriously, and there needs to be genuine consultation and genuine accommodation. We've seen case after case where this government and Premier Clark have simply been disrespectful of First Nations views as they push ahead on their projects, whether it was removing certain things from environmental assessment and having government representatives in Northeast BC thrown out of public forums by the First Nations who were hosting them, or whether it was the Premier shortly after she was elected leader calling into question a federal government decision, an environmental assessment decision on an issue that was key to the prosperity mine, key to the Tsilhqot'in people, which she is now falling all over herself to make amends with them. What this does do, from my point of view, is make very clear what we should all have known and what government should have accepted all along, that there are legitimate claims and legitimate rights, and we need to recognize them and build into the process of development in British Columbia respect for those rights, respect for the views and the claims, and true and genuine consultation and involvement. And when we do that, we can move forward together instead of having these tremendous conflicts, these issues tied up in the courts, First Nations having the only resort to protect their interests being to try to block things in the courts, or in the worst case scenario and with civil disobedience. This just is bad for investment, it's bad for development, it's bad for relations with First Nations, and it doesn't get us to the solution to the issue, which is to move forward together and to resolve these legitimate claims that have a long history of historical injustice.
The William case, as it's known because Chief Roger William of the Tsilhqot'in people brought the case, actually goes back 25 years. I think at one time or another it was fought by all of the premiers that I've covered, and SOCRED, NDP, and Liberal governments. Going forward, how do we put that history behind us?
Well, I think it was a reminder, the decision that, you know, the Constitution is a living thing, and the court ruling, as you have said, is 28 years of arguments by government and by the parties before the court. And, you know, I think from what we've heard from political leaders of all stripes, and we heard from the Truth and Reconciliation process again on a national basis, is that the 20th century was a failure in Canada around Aboriginal people, and the 21st century has to be, you know, when opportunities to help Aboriginal people realize their goals of self-reliance and to have a share of the wealth of this province, to take an equal place amongst all citizens. This is when things have to happen. We now have a court ruling that perhaps advances that.
You don't think it means a chill then on investment in British Columbia and development and progress?
I think you see a number of First Nations around British Columbia that want an economic partnership. And many are actively engaged in that, whether it's with the mining sector or with other, if it's with forestry and other Crown resources, where they're working with private sector organizations. So, you know, that's going to continue. Not every project is a good project. We know that, and we've seen even the federal government recently turn some down. This is not unique to Canada. However, British Columbia, of course, has the unique situation around unresolved treaties continuing to be a factor in this province that is not a factor in other provinces. But, you know, you see mining conflicts, for example, in many parts of Central and South America, and great business uncertainty caused by that. That's not what British Columbia wants. We want to have a high-value mining industry that finally gives Aboriginal people jobs. And when we get to the LNG discussion, I think we're going to do that, but I mean, Aboriginal people want to be a participant there, and they want to have benefits, and they want to learn skills and have their communities benefit.
You mentioned LNG. The government says that's the main reason they called the legislature together this fall. Almost every day in the House they suggest that you folks in your party don't actually support LNG. So let's go with Finance Minister Mike DeYoung talking about when he took the wraps off the new tax regime and get reaction from a couple of New Democrats about where their party stands. Here's Finance Minister Mike DeYoung.
The fact that over a 10-year period, from a single mid-sized facility, the province stands to receive between $8 and $9 billion in incremental revenue from a newly established industry that doesn't even take into account the added benefits of what that employment will represent for communities. That's, in my view, worth pursuing.
So what do you say? The government, you've heard it every day that you folks don't actually support LNG and you're opposed to it. What's the real position?
Well, the government says we don't believe it's worth pursuing, which is simply inaccurate. We believe there's opportunity here. We believe that opportunity has to bring a real fair return to British Columbians, that it has to provide jobs for British Columbians, not a reliance on temporary foreign workers, which means we have to train British Columbians. We have also said that it has to be developed in a way that protects our air, land, and water and respects the Liberals' own legislated greenhouse gas reduction targets, because if we don't, we will pay a great price down the road. And we don't think the Liberal government is being honest with British Columbians about what the real opportunity is here, as opposed to what the fanciful opportunities claimed by the Premier in the election campaign and right through to today are. We think British Columbians deserve to understand how this industry fits into a modern, diverse economic plan. For instance, there are people in the business community who have joked with me about saying they're thinking about putting up a website that says we do other things, because the Liberals are ignoring the technology industry. They're ignoring the film sector, both of which exist today. They provide many jobs today. There's more jobs in technology than oil and gas and mining and forestry put together, but that sector is concerned that they're not getting a minimal amount of help from the government in terms of training, because we're behind in graduates in the sciences, math and engineering. We need venture capital, or they're projecting that the growth rate, instead of being steady, will start to tail off. Now, these are sectors that are successful today. LNG has a place in BC, but it doesn't have a place in BC that shoves existing sectors to the side and sacrifices real growth there. And it doesn't have a place in BC if we don't have it as part of a plan that says we know there are going to be greenhouse gas emissions from this. We need to look at how we're going to address them and minimize them, and how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors of the economy and in personal transportation, home heating, etc., so that we meet our legislated commitments. That's the New Democrat position.
Before the election, Rob Fleming, I know you were involved in putting together the party's position, which you took into the campaign, dealing with the concern about fracking. Yeah. What's the position on that now? Because I often hear from people who say, what about the problem of fracking, which we do here in British Columbia to develop our gas resorts?
Right. And I think the concern around fracking is that, like many activities on the land base out there, it's not adequately monitored and understood. And certainly British Columbia is behind a number of other jurisdictions. Right here in North America, for example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has regulations to deal with some of the things that we're missing in Bill 2, which is the environmental bill around greenhouse gases, that measures methane escape and what kind of fugitive emissions are related to fracking. People in Canada and in British Columbia are very passionate about the water resource that we have here, unique in the world pretty much in terms of its quantity and quality. So what we were advancing, I think, before the election is something that was talked to with industry and with others who live in the northeast of the province. And it was about getting an assurance regime to show that water, in fact, is protected, that it's the volumes being used are sustainable, and all of those things, and that the public is getting a fair return for the use of that water.
We will be back with George Heyman and Rob Fleming and the New Democrats. Stay with us on Voice of BC.
I really do think there have to be some efforts to look at the institutions, because it's also true, and we saw that with Adrian Dix's attempt to campaign in a clean fashion and be positive that if you try to change the culture without also showing parties why they need each other, why treating each other with respect is productive for them, it's hard to get them to commit to a different kind of attitude.
This is Shaw TV.
Did you know Voice of BC is now on Facebook? Go to facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV to check out our video clip library, post a message on our wall, or click the link to view our past episodes archive.
Compulsive eating affects millions of people worldwide. If you feel powerless over food, Overeaters Anonymous can help. For more information about Overeaters Anonymous, visit our website at oa.org.
Did you know that Voice of BC has its own YouTube channel? Just go to youtube.com/Voice of BC. Here you will find hundreds of short video snapshots taken from past episodes of Voice of BC, organized into different categories for easy searching. Check us out and let us know what you think.
The members stand up and they say that they support resource development at a very high level, and they say it every day, and they think that that's going to convince people. But when it comes down to the details of what's actually happening on the ground, when it comes down to actually supporting things project by project, when it comes down to supporting things like the Northwest Transmission Line and other investments that government is making that are crucial to growing our economy, every single time they stand up and they oppose it. That will not grow the economy.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and during the break, George Heyman asked for extra time on fracking. Go ahead.
Well, all British Columbians want economic development, but the ones I talk to say they want some assurance that we're not doing it at the expense of significant environmental damage. So before the election, we proposed an experts panel to review fracking, which there's much controversy about. Many people have questions about it. And we said, let's leave it to independent experts and let's see what they say and act on recommendations they make. The Liberals, as a party, mocked us for that, even though their now MLA from Peace Service South, Mike Bernier, said it was a good idea. The representative of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers in BC said they'd welcome that because they needed that for social license. Well, if the Liberals had just adopted our idea, that review would have been done by now. People would know what we have to do to ensure that this is a safe process, the safest process it could be, and it would be done. Instead, we still don't know.
I have a question for you from Phil Hochstein. Here he is.
George, it's evident that the NDPs have at least two minds when it comes to private sector resource development. This despite the badly needed tax revenue and the jobs it would create. I think it's part of the NDP's plan to introduce a massive energy retrofit program to at least create the jobs that would be lost to saying no to resource development. George, where is the tax revenue going to come from to pay for this major infrastructure development, especially since there'll be less revenue from resource development?
Well, first of all, it's news to me that we oppose private sector resource development. We did propose that part of the carbon tax go toward public transit and energy retrofits, and we were going to support that with by bringing back 2% of the corporate income tax cut that had been put in place, 2% that the Liberals put back themselves and used for other purposes. The fact is that we don't say energy retrofit or other resource development. We say both because, for example, if we are going to live with some added emissions from LNG, we need to look at where else we're going to cut greenhouse gases. There are a lot of ways to do this that can be done by loans that are then paid back by energy savings off people's hydro bill. There's a lot of benefit. I think British Columbians want to see us do our part in greenhouse gas reduction. There's a lot of jobs in this, and there's a lot of benefit to householders down the road. It's not one or the other. It should be both.
Some questions for Rob Fleming coming up on the education file, but one I want to get out of the way before we get to that on transit, and here's Jarrah Hodge.
It's months since the mayor's proposed a transit plan, and we still have no clear timeline and proposal for a referendum from the provincial government. What do you think needs to happen at the provincial level so that the Lower Mainland can meet its transportation needs?
I guess we won't hear too much about what the referendum will actually say until after the civic elections are over, but what's your sense of where this thing is headed?
Well, hopefully it's not headed to the ditch, but it's not getting any help avoiding it from Transportation Minister Todd Stone. Let's be clear. I asked Todd Stone in the legislature once what other plans for transportation referenda he had, whether, for instance, the Massey Bridge, a $3 billion plus project without even a design, is going to be subject to referendum. And he said, no, but we're going to do it on TransLink. The business community, Ian Black, the head of the Board of Trade and a former Liberal cabinet minister, has pointed to the fact that if we do not build transportation infrastructure in Greater Vancouver, that it will have billions of dollars of cost to the economy. The economist for the BC Business Council said the same thing in Finance Committee hearings, and yet every time the mayors make a proposal for a tax option to fund transit, Todd Stone rejects it out of hand. So sometime after the municipal elections, I think sometime in December, the mayors have said they're going to craft a referendum question to fund the very good 30-year vision plan they put forward. Todd Stone's answer to that is, maybe their time frame should be doubled. There's a cost to the economy for that. There's a cost to livability for that. The population's growing. TransLink doesn't even have money to put more buses on the road. It's time for the minister to either say, we're going to forget the referendum, we're going to agree on a tax structure, which he won't do, or to say, I'm going to work with the mayors, I'm going to say yes to their proposals for funding options, we'll put it to a referendum, and I'm going to work with them to see this referendum pass, because the alternative, a failure to pass the referendum, a failure to build rapid transit, a failure to relieve congestion on the roads, is not only bad for the residents, it's bad for the economy. Ken Peacock, the economist for the Business Council, said in response to my question at the Finance Committee that he didn't have an exact number of the costs to the economy of failing to build transit to relieve congestion, but he said it's in the billions.
Well, we had the Premier rattling the NDP there a little bit with her challenge, so let's hear from Andrew Weaver and the Greens, and then we'll get on to some education questions. Here's Andrew.
George and Rob, you'll recall back in the spring session, I put forward a motion to amend the throne speech to actually have the BC government take steps to limit the export of thermal coal out of Vancouver ports. Rob, you weren't there for the vote. George, can you tell me why you and every other member of the NDP voted against my motion?
We voted against the motion for a very simple reason. If you put forward an amendment to a speech or a bill, the presumption is if it passes, you're going to support it. And there's nothing in that throne speech we could support. And to imply that with this one change we could do it would simply be wrong, and therefore we didn't do it.
He did it again this year too, didn't he? Yes. How'd you vote this time?
Well, this is the repeat playbook, and I'm not sure why Andrew Weaver came down to amend throne speeches. He's very effective at some other things, and I think you can run the clock and pursue parliamentary tactics when you need to. This government has used closure on all kinds of bills. It's offensive to most people, but I think there's probably some ways that Andrew could pursue his passion around coal and climate and other issues that don't involve, this sort of chicanery of Parliament, but get straight at the issue.
How do you deal with him politically in the political arena?
Well, we work with him when he's putting forward good issues. For instance, we're currently in committee stage on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. He's putting forward some thoughtful amendments and commentary, and we're supporting him on those.
Yeah. I did promise some education questions. Was it only a month ago that there wasn't a bigger story in British Columbia than the teachers' dispute? We have a few questions about that, not surprisingly. Let's go to David Schreck. First one for Rob Fleming. Here's David.
Rob, we finally have a negotiated settlement for the teachers. Would it have been better to go your route and have it be arbitrated? How much more would that have cost? I can see the 2017 election when the Liberals run attack ads saying the NDP would have given the shop away in arbitration. How are you going to answer that one?
You know he saves his meanest questions for New Democrats. Right?
I think what an arbitrated settlement would have done is it would have taken the slight gap where the parties were at on the Labor Day weekend, when the entire province of British Columbia, every parent, every kid, everyone who had an interest in seeing schools open on the day they were scheduled to be open after they disastrously closed in June, it would have bridged those very narrow differences. And that's where we got to 3 weeks later. I think Vince Reddy at that point in time was a supervising mediator. All it would have required would have been to give him binding powers on fixing the remaining items. In the end, what's interesting is the government said, well, we won't sign a blank check. But they took a significant number of the issues around the uncertainty on class size and composition and whatever the cost may be to fulfill those, because they have two constitutional Supreme Court rulings against them, and they punted it down the road. Those are before the courts again. So no, I think what we called for, which was in tune with what 3/4 of British Columbians supported at that time, to have arbitration on the remaining outstanding issues at that time would have probably cost about the same. The settlement would have been almost identical to what was achieved, but we would have avoided 3 weeks of absolute pain and suffering for kids and for parents. You know, for the conflict that is so disruptive in the public education system. We saw growth in private school enrollment go up predictably. We've seen people, I think, become quite angry with the government because they have made public education such a battleground. Normally, a school is and should be one of the most harmonious places you can be. It's a wonderful community for people who have school-age kids to be a part of in their lives. It's enriching in every way. And this government set up all kinds of schemes and spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars through a rebate scheme to drive straight through your kids and pursue a conflictual agenda with the teachers. And at the end of the day, the settlement that we got is one that could have been there if they'd actually used the summer to either negotiate it or to empower Vince Reddy to end it.
You mentioned the rise of the public, of the people putting their kids in private school, and that was an issue lurking in the background throughout. Right. The dispute was whether that was an agenda matter for the government. We had Peter Fassbender on the show right after the settlement. There's a whole bunch of things he said that you might want to debate with him, but I picked that one out and to get your reaction. So here's the Education Minister, Peter Fassbender.
What we've seen is people choose independent schools for a variety of reasons. There are some faith-based, but not all of them are that. Some are very academically oriented, but not all of them are that. They offer different types of programs. There's different levels of parental involvement in some of them. I don't think we will ever see the day where the public education system is going to be replaced. Some people have suggested we want to privatize public education. That is absolutely not where we want to go.
Well,
I in part agree with the minister on this, because you still have 9 in 10 kids almost in public education. It simply is not an option for most families, and most people, most British Columbians have positive experiences in public education themselves. They want the same thing for their kids, and I think if there's anything positive that you can take away from this strike, it's that the public's appreciation for the teaching profession and for the jobs they do and the effort they make on behalf of our kids, I think went up significantly. So there are some people, because they're two working parent families and others, that the amount of disruption, the longest school strike in history that affected 2 back-to-back school years, 5 weeks lost, that hurt them. I talked to self-employed people who simply couldn't, bid on work and take contracts because they had no certainty as to whether their kids would be in school. There are some people in the economy, because the Liberals have been so disruptive in public education, who have told me that they are looking at the private option. It's not because their faith is undone in the public education system. So I don't think the growth has been tremendous in private education. I think the public education system is incredibly strong. And unless the government has a school reform agenda that is there to undermine public education through legislation and through other schemes in terms of how the system is funded. I see it remaining strong, but there is a lot of tension within the system. There is a 5-year budget freeze that this government has imposed that is causing a lot of fraying around the edges. And for parents who have children with special learning needs in particular, it has become unbearable for a number of parents and kids in certain situations. The resources are spread far too thin. That was the issue that the teachers advanced in this dispute. They made some progress. They said that was their number one issue, and again, that was where their emphasis was on the eventual settlement. But there's going to be a lot of work to do, and when we get to the 2015-16 budget making process, we're going to be hearing about it again from public education leaders and here in the legislature.
From start to finish in the dispute, the issue of education resources in the classroom for children with special needs came up again and again. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Seth Klein, with a question about a specific aspect of that. Here's Seth.
It's been about 2 years now since Rick Moore of North Vancouver won his case at the Supreme Court of Canada, in which the school board was found to have provided inadequate support to his son with a learning disability. The court ruled in particular that providing adequate special education was not a dispensable luxury. But it's unclear what the long-term consequence of that court victory has been for other children. What should the result of this decision be for other school boards and for the ministry itself?
Do you know where this stands now?
Well, government has some time to respond. I think what you're seeing is a phenomena of on outspoken or high-profile cases, sometimes you see a resolution, as you should, but there are a lot of instances where special needs learners are being let down, the resources are not being provided, and parents, for whatever reasons, are not able to advocate effectively for those kids. And it's a very, very sad situation when you come across those examples. But I think the key issue, and Seth will understand this too, is that it's what government doesn't know, or school districts that administer the education system, because the assessment, the resources for assessments is so behind where it should be. I mean, you have children routinely waiting 2 and 3 grades to have an individual education plan designed around them, to have the assessments done by school psychologists. And those are some of the positions that have been eliminated in the greatest numbers over the last decade in the education system. So you can well imagine losing ground and losing confidence from 2 or 3 years of falling behind in reading and basic skills in the education system is making a problem worse. And that's where I think Minister Fassbender and others, as an outcome of the strike, and in order to build goodwill, if he's truly genuine about that, he said, now is a time for healing with the BCTF. This is an issue where they have to, regardless of what the courts rule in this latest appeal process, where they have to get together with the teaching profession and with school administrators and say, okay, here are some of the standards we have, admit to some of the mistakes they've made around recategorization of special needs students, and work with parent groups.
Vaughn,
Go ahead.
What we have now is, unfortunately, the government making a choice between resources for children with special needs and other students in the class. And what that fails to recognize is that people say the most important investment a government can make is in education of our children, not only for their future, but for the health of the economy down the road. Eventually, that investment comes back many times over by productive, trained people, whether they're workers or professionals or whatever role they play in the economy. And unfortunately, what we saw in the legislature this week was a Liberal MLA, Mark Dalton, who stood up and began to sing the praises of independent schools and special classes for children with special needs, presumably for those parents who could afford to send them, which completely betrays an ignorance of the long history of actually working towards inclusion of all children in the education system.
And with that, we will take a brief break with Rob Fleming and George Heyman. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Probably the only way to get Premier Christy Clark's attention on the transit and transportation referendum in Metro Vancouver is to add a promise that the buses will be powered by LNG and SkyTrain as well.
.24/7. Current. News. Only on Shaw TV.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Check us out online by Googling Voice of BC on Shaw TV, where you can watch this show or past episodes of Voice of BC. And of course, you can always catch an encore presentation on your local Shaw TV. In the Lower Mainland, watch on Saturday afternoon at 1 or Sunday at 2 p.m. On Vancouver Island, we're on at 10 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday afternoon at 2. For all other parts of the province, contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Team, you have eyes on subject. You get the tongs, son.
Canadian television, we're on your screen.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca or write to us at 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2.
I was pretty excited when I first heard that John Horgan had appointed a critic for TransLink, but that role has become more about the provincial government's handling of TransLink rather than looking at the transit authority and the way it's being mismanaged by its overpaid executives. In fact, the NDP have become de facto apologists for TransLink waste.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. Next week on the show, we have David Keane on, and he is the head of the new LNG Alliance in British Columbia, and with the legislature still, as our two guests tonight have discussed, debating the tax and regulatory regime for LNG. We'll see what he has to say about it all, and whether we're ever actually just going to see one of these things instead of just talking about them. Tonight we have George Heyman and Rob Fleming on the show, and it being civic election time in British Columbia and school board elections, Bill Thielman has trolled out an issue on this one, and here he is.
We have a major controversy here in Vancouver where the local school board has rejected funding from Chevron, the oil company, saying it's inappropriate for a corporation to sponsor programs in the schools. But other school districts have accepted it. What's your view?
Come on, both of you. What's your view?
Well, I understand the position that school boards are in, and I respect the decisions they make on this kind of issue, regardless of where the donations are coming from. The fact is that school boards are significantly underfunded, and now in British Columbia, I think we are so far below the Canadian average in per pupil funding. It's getting close to $1,000 per student, and in 2006 we were at or even slightly above the average of Canadian provinces. So it's no surprise to me that when the government downloads significant costs, whether it's BC Hydro cost increases or funding the cost entirely from their funding envelope around CUPE wage settlements, unfunded pension liabilities, maintenance costs, on and on it goes. They're supposed to now save capital cost contributions from operating funds. They're looking at revenues. Typically they start by leaning on parents, parent advisory councils and district PACs. Have to hit fundraising targets higher than you'd ever imagine to pay for things like textbooks, technology in classrooms, all of the things that one would expect government would be supportive of. So when Chevron or somebody else is approaching the school district on this basis, yeah, I think it's based on motorists at the pump and whether they choose to identify and support the school. I can understand why they do it, and I also trust school trustees to be able to set the parameters around that. I mean, I know trustees in many districts. They are not interested in their schools becoming centers of advertising for corporate BC. So they'll set the policy around what these donations entail and how they're used. But they're in a tough position, is my point. Districts have a hard time turning funds down from anywhere.
Some districts have taken the money, some said no, right?
Some have, some haven't, and I think we should respect their decision making. I think what is true is that most parents don't want to see their children at a young age exposed to advertising and logos throughout the school system. This is a time when they're forming their opinions of the world. I'm surprised that that Bill didn't ask a question about the fact that teachers appear to be subsidizing materials for the classroom out of their own paychecks, even after a long strike. That's something that deserves a long, hard look and is completely inappropriate. We had at the Finance Committee, school board after school board, just talk about, as Rob did, the forced increases in expenditure that weren't funded by the provincial government. That's at the root of all of this.
Jordan Bateman, question. Here we go.
George, the provincial government seems to have an abysmal record when it comes to managing investments in information technology. Whether it was BC ESIS, the Integrated Case Management System, BC Ambulances, electronic patient care records, there just seems to be more and more examples of government taking too long, spending too much money, and getting very buggy programs back in return. How can government improve its record on information technology and better protect taxpayers?
Well, there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the government has a decade-long history of having farmed out responsibility for information technology to large private sector corporations that have failed to deliver. We see the results of effective lobbying. We see the case management system that has been an abysmal failure from day one, and that's because it was actually designed for something entirely other than a complex case management system where you're tracking families and kids. It was designed to look after inventory. So I think the first thing the government needs to do is just review their whole policy and have an assessment about what's most effective to be done in-house and what's most effective to put out to tender, and then what the parameters around that tender will be, and ensure that that the decisions that are made about the software and systems that will be purchased are sound ones and that they'll work. The other thing they need to do, and this was shown by the Auditor General in his report on both the information integrity of some of the systems as well as the deliverables on the contracts, that the ministries that had let the contracts weren't properly monitoring them. So, for instance, there was a lot of talk 10 years ago when medical record systems were contracted out to a company called Maximus, that measures would be in place to ensure that British Columbians' medical information wouldn't be accessible by the secret courts in the United States that were established under the USA Patriot Act. The Auditor General found that the Ministry of Health was simply taking the contractor's word for it, that they were following certain measures, but they had no way of determining if this was true. And in fact, in some cases, it wasn't. And in other cases, deliverables that were promised by the contractor were simply not met. Now, if you have a contractor who's not meeting what they're being paid for, there should be clauses in the contract that are acted on in the public interest to ensure that's done. That is not being done, and that is what this government needs to do in order to restore faith in their management.
This is a question that affects Rob that George is going to have to answer for legal reasons. This like, you don't ever have to make stuff up in British Columbia because just stuff happens all the time and you go, God, that's a weird story. Here is our Attorney General and Minister of Justice when she was on the show recently, Suzanne Anton, talking about the practice of the Crown indemnifying, paying the legal bills of people in the government filing lawsuits against other people. Let's go to Suzanne Anton.
The answer is, I'm not going to talk about a specific case, but what I will say is that we do have an indemnity. Interestingly enough, the indemnity for about 20 years now has covered a defamation case, so that's part of the package. But it's a process where senior staff are entitled to an indemnity in a lawsuit, and it's a decision made at the Deputy Attorney General level, so it's not a political decision as to who receives indemnity.
So the case she's refusing to talk about is the Deputy Minister, Athana Mentzelopoulos, suing this miscreant over here, Rob Fleming. And on legal advice, he shouldn't talk about it. And given that the matter is before the courts, we probably shouldn't say too much about it either, except for this. What do you think of the policy in general that allows a Deputy Minister to sue an MLA for something he said?
Well, I think to establish a regime in which deputy ministers would be reimbursed by the taxpayer for launching on their own motion a lawsuit about defamation, where nobody has been able to demonstrate any real harm, is questionable. You know, if the lawsuit has merit, usually lawsuits for defamation, if a private citizen launches a lawsuit for defamation, the settlement usually encompasses damages, including costs. This just seems completely out of line to me, and I think the minister didn't do much better answering your question than she has in question period in the House.
You folks in the House this week pointed out that you discovered that 2 people in the ethnic outreach scandal had been indemnified, and the Minister of Finance said, "I'll take the question on notice." Have you gotten an answer to who it was?
No, to my knowledge, we have not. So for the minister to not even know the names or the details comes as a surprise, because this policy has been so controversial.
It is the policy under which Dave Bassey and Rob Burt had their $6 million worth of legal bills paid
after pleading guilty,
forgiven after they pleaded guilty. So
so guilty of the crime, the government held their assets and property against that, and they released it all back to them. So it's shocking, and you know, Stephen Toop, after that controversy, the former president of UBC, was tasked with producing a report on the use of indemnification, and he made some interesting recommendations. And
he said there may be cases where you need to have the policy, right? He didn't say you should never do it, but I think, well, it would be interesting. Maybe we'll get him on as a guest and ask him.
The general principle is that that public servants should be indemnified, provided they're not actually guilty of a criminal act, for lawsuits that arise out of them acting in the course of their duties. I don't believe that the Metsalopoulos lawsuit fits those criteria or that general principle, and I think if the shoe was on the other foot, you'd hear the Liberals loudly and clearly denouncing us.
Interesting. We'll see what happens when it goes to court. Let's go to... We did a show this fall with 2 different groups that are proposing to build an oil refinery in British Columbia, to not ship raw Alberta oil out of the coast, but in fact refine it here. And I know, well, let's go to David Black, who's one of the proponents, the first one, talking about that idea, and then we'll see if the 2 New Democrats on the show think the idea has any merit whatsoever. Here's David Black.
I'm trying to foster an industry which maybe doesn't make as much money as it would for somebody else, but that helps Canada a lot. And so if we can build tens of thousands of new permanent jobs and create billions of dollars more taxes, and do it all in a way that's much better for the environment than if it goes a different direction, then I'll feel I've done a good thing here at the end of my career.
I asked him why, if this is such a great idea, the oil industry hasn't done it, and he said, well, because they don't think they'll make enough money out of refining the product. They make more money just selling the raw material. Has this idea got any merit at all?
Well, the idea of refining crude, whether it's bitumen or crude, in the country and adding value to the resource and creating jobs is in general a good run. One of the problems, I would say a significant problem with Mr. Black's proposal, is that it still involves a piping of bitumen from Alberta across something like 700 fish-bearing streams in northern British Columbia, which has been opposed to get it to Kitimat, which has been opposed by a large number of First Nations on the route. Now, it does deal with the issue of tankers filled with bitumen in very treacherous waters outside of Kitimat and BC's northern coast. So that's a significant problem, and it's one that, if this proposal is to have any merit, needs to be subjected to a real environmental assessment. But it doesn't take that pipeline out of the equation. One could put the refinery close to where the oil sands actually are and avoid that problem. And I'm not quite clear why that proposal hasn't been made.
Before, well, I know the answer to that, but phone David Black up and ask him, because he got asked that on the show. He says it's because these things are built offshore and you bring them in and you assemble them in parts and they need to be on the coast. But that's, it wouldn't be fair to have a member of the legislature from one of the ridings in Victoria, where I live as well, and not to deal with this issue. And another mischief maker who tapes many questions for us on this show, Jordan Bateman, here he is.
Rob, the $800 million Sea Terrace sewage project in Greater Victoria has turned into a grade A debacle. No shovels in the ground, tens of millions of dollars already spent, hopelessly over budget already, and they don't even have a site to put the plant now that Esquimalt has turned them down. What can the Capital Regional District do to get themselves out of this mess? And can they do it in a way to protect taxpayers?
Yeah, and I think most of the discussion on this, it's ongoing in the election, but I think most people are waiting to see what happens, who's around the CRD table, whether the sites that have been identified are well and truly not viable anymore. We've got a lot of discussions happening now about a 2-plant solution. So there has been a lot of what I would call flaky talk around sewage treatment systems.
You can tell he's not running in this election.
That's right. But there are some different ideas, I would say, that have emerged recently that do have merit. I mean, it may come to, at the end of the day, though, the provincial government giving direction. They have sort of, acted, even though they're a significant funder, even though they insisted on a CTERA-like management consortium for when construction would begin on project advice and project implementation. They've acted very aloof as things have fallen off the rails. So I'm surprised they're in legislation around the Local Government Act. There is a process to have a formalized mediation. They have chose to not apply really any pressure to some of the people around the CRD table who are having disagreements. But I have no doubt that we are going to get somewhere on this discussion. I know it's been a 3-decade-old issue in this region. But the key thing is that people, mayors, councillors, or anybody else, not do things that are going to jeopardize the significant contribution that is there from both the provincial and the federal government.
And those are time dated. They can expire if they don't. Yeah. George, I wanted to finish up on this issue of the referendum. I mentioned to you I do a regular commentary on Canadian affairs on Seattle radio, and in Seattle this week, on their election week, they had a referendum on the bus service, and the voters went for it. And they've had trouble getting these through in the past. And one of the things they did there was they put out a specific menu. They said these are the bus routes that you're gonna pay for if you say yes, and they're not going to happen if you say no. I mean, I recognize that your party position and a lot of other people's position is we shouldn't even have this referendum, and as you've also noted, the government is determined to have one. If we have to have a referendum, what's your idea of how it should be approached? What should it look like?
Well, it should be clear. I think people need to know what the funding that's being asked for is going to go to build or to enhance in the case of adding more buses. It's also true that TransLink is responsible for some roads and bridges. It's also responsible for a certain amount of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So there's a couple of things here. People need to know that these are the routes I'm going to get in my community, and in the case of drivers, they need to know that the end result of this, if I'm in a place where I have no choice but to drive, is that there will be fewer cars on the road and I will get to where I'm going more quickly. I think people also need to know that if they're not spending it on transit, they're going to be spending it on road infrastructure that will inevitably remain congested, and that there's also an economic cost to it. So I think the full suite has to be there. People, I think you've correctly pointed out, people need to know what they're getting for their money. I've never seen a municipal referendum for an amount of money for a specific thing fail, and people also need to understand that there's a broad supportive coalition.
And thank you for that, George. It's a good way to end the show with a specific. Thank you, Mr. Fleming, for being on the show. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night. Oh, next week we're going to do a show on the LNG industry, and I hope you're watching. Thanks for watching. Good night.